Hello, and welcome to Ghouls Disability and Horror Day, a day of panels celebrating the disability community and its relationship to horror. I'm Ariel Basca,
And I'm Robbie Sitabi.
and we are your hosts for today. And before we get started, we'd like to just take a minute to describe ourselves. I'm Ariel Basca. I am a white woman with blonde hair, wearing headphones in a pink shirt with a multicolored shawl on and necklace in front of a purple poster that reads Our First Priority. My pronouns are she, her.
And I'm Rabia Sitabi. I am Egyptian Indian, so I have a caramel toned skin, if you may. I'm wearing glasses. I'm wearing a really big mint sage colored hoodie, which is made by a brand that supports neurodivergent and ADHD people in Canada to get jobs. Go Dreamers. And what else? My pronouns are she, her, and I think that pretty much covers it. I am pleasantly voluptuous, as as you would say, and in general, my hair is right now slicked back. So.
And we are so delighted to be able to welcome two amazing creators to this panel today to talk specifically about identity and disability and horror. And what we would like to do is just really quickly, briefly tell you who we are, and then we'll have our panelists introduce themselves. I am an award-winning, multiply disabled horror and documentary filmmaker. My horror short about medical gaslighting, Our First Priority, which I wrote and directed, won the Disability Advocacy Award from Superfest Disability Film Festival and was an official selection of Fright Fest UK and many others. I've also produced several projects, both narrative and documentary, including Mike Mignola Drawing Monsters, about the creator of Hellboy. Additionally, I was a speaker at South by Southwest in 2022 with Rabia, and I am a recipient of multiple scholarships from Sundance CoLab. I am the founder and co-host of Ride the Omnibus, Inc., a nonprofit and podcast parked at the intersection of pop culture and social justice.
I always love hearing you describe yourself because there's that list keeps just adding to it and becoming longer. I am a queer disabled pop culture and marketing expert. I'm born in Europe. I'm of Asian and African descent, as I mentioned before. I'm the director of marketing of the Imagine Fantastic Film Festival here in the Netherlands, which is part of the Millier Foundation or the Fantastic Film Foundation. I have a marketing agency, actually two, one called Arpish and the other one called Culture Agency. With Culture Agency, I support women of color trying to get into the entertainment business. And I've worked for numerous horror and genre film festivals internationally, either as a host or in programming, publicity, marketing, and special projects. Appear regularly on Dutch television and radio to discuss pop culture and pop culture trends. And I'm the co host of two podcasts, Ride the Omnibus, as Ariel just mentioned, a podcast parked at the intersection of pop culture and in social justice, and The Cultured Curators, which I do with Benjamin Frankenberg, which is a podcast about film, food, and tentacles.
So we are delighted to welcome today Colin Buckingham. Colin, if you would be so good as to introduce yourself.
Sure. My name's Colin Buckingham. My pronouns are he and they. I'm a white person with sort of brownish facial hair, and in this light it looks like brown, curly, longish hair on the top of my head. And I'm wearing a dark green sweater and in front of a split wall that is half dark green and half gray. I think that.
And if you don't mind introducing yourself and your work as a writer as well.
So I am a writer, a producer. I've won a couple awards for a short that I produced that this is like this little fight film short thing. And I also do consulting work for projects that feature skeletal dysplasia, specifically dwarfism, and co-wrote a pilot with some people from Respectability that we're very excited about right now. That's getting some good interest, and yeah, so I recently founded a production company called Chromatic Lens that's inspired by my history, both as a musician and as someone who wants to create work that uplifts and amplifies people that need it the most.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Colin. I should also mention that Colin, myself, and Nisreen are also members, alumni of Respectability. I am currently a lab fellow at Respectability, but they are both alumni as well, which is an organization that helps disabled creatives in the entertainment industry. So, Nisreen, would you like to introduce yourself? Oh, you're on mute. Sorry.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Great. Hi, my name is Nasreen Al-Khatib. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I'm currently in Scotland. I don't live here. I'm here for the first time making a film, but I'm usually in Los Angeles, which is Tongva land. I am a thick, multi-heritage woman who's half Iraqi and half Black. My hair is super curly right now. It's up down past my waist, but it's pretty hot here. I have 7 identities. I have 6 disabilities, 5 of which are invisible, 1 of which is visible sometimes. I'm sitting in a gray chair. I am wearing a black Blade Runner t-shirt with Rachel and an owl on it. There is a brown wall behind me with checkered curtains to one side. I am a filmmaker. I create content for film and television that focuses on normalizing intersectional realities. Let me know what else you want to know.
Well, however you want to introduce yourself, and that's perfectly fine. And I would love to just quickly state that because we are specifically disabled creators, all of us, and this is kind of a marathon to a certain degree, and all of us have different ways that we interact with screens and the way that we interact with kind of being in place at one time. We will have kind of a loose and flexible schedule for today to a certain degree. So if anyone needs anything, feel free to bring it up, and we will address that and adapt as necessary throughout today. But I want to quickly say, before we get started, because this conversation is specifically about horror identity and disability identity, I wondered if each of you could take a moment to maybe talk a little bit about how you first identified yourself with both horror and disability. So what was the first horror thing that you saw and that gave you a special lens on your own disability and your own journey of disability? Nisreen, would you like to start?
Sure, yeah. Really, the first horror movies I saw were quite young. I was not aware yet that I was going to be disabled in life. So horror films resonated with me because I found something that was scarier than being, an immigrant or a Muslim or a person with melanated skin. So yeah, horror was very comforting and still is. And it actually inspired me to go into film itself. My first horror film I watched when I was 7 just sort of like left an imprint and opened up possibilities that I didn't know existed.
Do you mind sharing what the first horror film was?
Sure, it was The Fly.
Were you watching it at home? Was it in a setting with your family?
Yeah, it was actually. So my father was not great at fathering, and this was the one time I'm glad he wasn't, because he actually let me watch The Fly with him. I don't think he realized how young I was or how impressionable it could be. And so, I thank him for that today. because it also, you know, made my suspension of belief much stronger, and allowed me to like enjoy horror in a totally different space. I have lots of friends who are like, "No, I can't do horror. It's too real." And I'm like, "I love it. Scare me."
Yeah. Yeah. The reason that I asked is because it sounds very similar to a lot of people with immigrant backgrounds, where their parents just had, a horror movie on, and you were just in the room, and that's how your first exposure to horror happened. So it sounds very recognizable. Something for me as well. I was 6 years old when I walked into the room, and my mom was watching The Thing, and that was just, I mean, it's not great parenting, but yeah, I mean, I'm just going in and watching it. So to see that that is the thing that sparked our interest in horror is, yeah, it's cool to hear.
Absolutely, yeah, happenstance completely. My mother forbid it, so I'm so lucky that it happened.
I also had parents who forbade me from watching horror, etc., but that didn't stop a bad babysitter from bringing over A Nightmare on Elm Street. So, yeah, age 3, Freddy Krueger all the way. Like, I identified so strongly with Freddy. I actually have an essay coming out in Hear Us Scream Volume 2, specifically about my relationship to trauma and Freddy Krueger. But it's fascinating to me how being exposed at an early age, I think particularly for people who become creators, people who are disabled, seems to have a lasting imprint on a lot of us. Colin, do you have a similar experience?
No, actually. So I was terrified of horror movies as a kid. I would get scared by like the Magic School Bus, honestly. Sometimes when they would like go to stuff. So I was very frightened of a lot of things. And it wasn't until I started watching behind the scenes stuff of movies, because I would really like watching gag reels and that kind of thing, that I started kind of like got more into how it's done. And then I was actually like an extra in a horror movie that was shooting near my high school. Like that was my first acting job. And so I got like the behind the scenes, like how all the blood bags work and how it like, it was like this, like gore fest, like explosion, like of like, someone gets wounded and like a fountain just shoots out of them. So it was more of like, oh, this is all hilarious. Like this is like how this happens is all so um, completely just outrageous, and that kind of thing. That it's sort of lifting of the curtain. I honestly helped me watch horror movies, because then I would just watch through the lens of like, how did they do this, and like that kind of thing. So, and also in a way, I had a bit of a disconnect from my own disability, just for various reasons. I didn't really identify as disabled for a long time with dwarfism, because like it just felt like oh, I'm just smaller and that kind of thing, and I hadn't learned the multiple definitions of disability, which include the psychological exclusion from things, or like people's bias excluding you from things, and then also like the back pain and stuff, which is, I was just like, oh, that's just being a human, you get back pain. And it's like, no, that's also dwarfism stuff. So it's like that I think honestly helped me confront stuff, because I was also like avoiding horror movies because I knew of the tropes of like people would call me like Chucky and like that kind of thing in the list of things that I would get made fun of, and like pop culture references that people would shout at me, in addition to like the Leprechaun movies and like that kind of thing. So I kind of subconsciously avoided it for a long time. But I think Carrie honestly kind of helped me come to terms with it, because it was sort of a thing of like, oh, this person can't control something, and that's, people are making fun of them for it, and it's because of feeling different from the other people and feeling ostracized and having people pile on top of that. And even obviously like there's a lot of differences between me and Carrie, but that kind of theme of society not understanding and ostracizing you, I think honestly helped me confront that.
Wow. I mean, Carrie is such a great film too for kind of thinking about a lot of those issues, both as, someone with disabilities, but, for me watching it as an adolescent, it certainly had a lot of resonance for me as well. But it's so interesting to hear you talk about that aspect of, kind of the difference between, your experience and other people's experience in general of the world, and kind of how your disability identity was something that almost, took you that long to embrace in certain ways. Um, did you find that that was true for you as well, Nisreen, or did you have a different experience?
Did I find what was true for me?
Taking your time to really explore and embrace your disability identity.
It took about I grew up with chronic pain um, and asthma, um, but it wasn't until I got hit by a car and actually became like I could no longer move, that I realized, oh, I've actually been disabled much longer than now. This is just another disability I'm acquiring. So there was an education period of about a year and a half for me to realize, one, you are disabled. You've been disabled your whole life. There's just a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. And that's why your family doesn't describe it that way. And your friends don't describe it that way, even though they also have disabilities as well. Um, and then it took me a little while to break down that preconstruction, that notion that there's something wrong with disability.
That sounds painfully relatable. Yeah. How about Ariel yourself?
Well, for me, my whole issue was that I actually likewise had family that did not want to acknowledge me as disabled, and very specifically wanted, even though I was born with a very rare congenital syndrome that left me deaf and blind on the right side, my parents didn't want to acknowledge that basically. And so I was never allowed to be in any special education programs, et cetera. They fought to make sure I only was ever put in gifted education programs. And anytime anyone tried to label me as something other than what I was, and I was very visibly different because I was born with a congenital hemangioma or birthmark that covered the right side of my face. Um, it was to them something that needed to be covered up with makeup, with laser surgery later on in life. Um, and it's interesting how horror films for me, I specifically mentioned Freddy Krueger because it was the first time I was allowed to see someone with a facial difference on screen, where I was able to see disfigurement and see someone who looked like me on screen and sort of understand why the bullies at school were calling me monster or pizza face, because nobody would actually tell me except the bullies that I looked different. Um, Parents and well-meaning teachers would say things like, "Oh, you look the same as everybody else," you know. And I think we all know in the disability community how invalidating that is as an experience. And so for me, horror was where I found validation for the first time, um, in a lot of ways. And so for me, that was A Nightmare on Elm Street. But that was my experience. How about you, Rabia?
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. For me, the acknowledgement of disability also came very late in life. I come from North African and Asian parentage, so if there's anything wrong, you just work harder, especially because you're, a brown migrant in a white country. Be happy that you're here, work harder, put your shoulders underneath it, and just keep going. There's nothing wrong. You just need to work harder. And that's constantly what was told to me till deep into my 20s. And I finally, after being gaslit also by doctors, found out that I had been living not with one, but several disabilities on me. They were, as you would call, not visible or invisible, but they had progressed to a point that they were affecting my health and my ability to um, not just be productive, because that's very, very ableist notion, but just live, just go through daily life, wake up, take care of myself, maybe like walk to the end of the street and not collapse, or being able to eat something and not end up in a hospital, being able to focus on something. My neurodivergent diagnosis didn't come until I was, in my 30s already, where they were like, oh, yeah, you have autism and ADHD, but you're high functioning, so we're not going to do anything about it. Which is something I'm still dealing with right now. I'm not getting therapy or medication for either of those things, on top of my physical disabilities, where I'm getting minimal help. Um, so for me, it all came very late in life, but I always felt connected to horror in a way that horror for me was like comfort food. It was something, at the end of the day, like, it was sort of an escapism. And weirdly enough, my life was so so messed up that horror seemed like cool. It seemed like funny. I don't know. It seemed like something I could relate to, the trauma almost, to the characters in movies were going through, because I was like, yeah, my life is unfortunately close to being as fucked up as that. But there's, at least this person has it worse. I can empathize and sympathize. So it was me, being held by my hand, but with horror. Like, I had a place to escape to, that at least, no, not everyone was going like, oh, you just have to try harder. Or at least, you're not a starving child in Africa. You have opportunities in this country. And just forget that, all the racism that you're facing, and the medical gaslighting, and all the pain that you're going through daily. Just ignore it, which people would constantly say. And with horror, it was like, fuck it, this is happening. Just, let it just come, face it, let it come over you, see how you deal with it. What do you identify with? What do you don't identify with? But not with, at least I wasn't being gaslit by it. So yeah, comfort food. For me, horror has become comfort food. And it helped me a lot, because and I'm hoping that one day they'll make it a mainstream therapy type of thing. But being exposed to horror at such a young age helped me stress manage a lot better throughout life. So whenever bad news would come on my path and I would have to deal with something awful happening in my life, I wouldn't panic as much. I would fairly be okay in my fight or flight type of response. My response would be fight, or would be like, okay, let's rationalize this and get through it. And that mainly is because I had desensitized myself to a point with horror at that point, that I could deal better with stuff in daily life. Weirdly enough, so yeah, that's kind of my journey.
That makes perfect sense too. And by the way, like, we've done a little bit of digging and found that there are actually modules out there for therapy through horror, that people are developing currently in the United States. And so hopefully we'll be able to share a little bit about those resources when they go live. But I'm really excited about the prospect of what that means for us going forward as a country, um, acknowledging trauma in a different way that may reach more people. Um, I also wanted to kind of go back to something that Colin was talking about, which is specifically how people with visibles and both visible and non-visible disabilities are represented on screen. You were talking a little bit about being, you know, called out as Chucky or Leprechaun or hurtful things of that nature. And so I wonder if you could maybe take a minute to kind of talk a little bit about how that's affected your own identity and identity formation.
Sure. I also wanted to comment that it's interesting, the common thread that you and Rabia have of the horror things, like calling a spade, or like just being the one thing that's like, no, this exists. Like, you're not like, we're not pretending that it doesn't. And because like that's both something in horror of like the group of people that pretend that the killer isn't there, like, no, everything's fine. And then also just in, yeah, it's just the parallels of that, not only that, but like the real life horror parallels of the ostrich head in the sand is interesting. But yeah, so with that identity formation, it's sort of like, because you were saying it's something about like people like wanting to, like, having this aversion to being placed in special ed. And I remember having to deal with that with like, because my hands, like, and limbs are affected from dwarfism, so I would need extra time to like handwrite things. And so they would just be like, okay, we'll just go with all the quote unquote special ed kids. And I would be averse to it because I was like, I don't need another thing. Like, I don't need another thing. I'm already getting heat and I'm already getting so much flack for like all this other stuff. I don't need this as well. And at the time I was like, 10, you don't have the tools to unpack, the systemic failures that have happened to get to that point of like ostracization and, like not treating neurodivergence well and that kind of thing. So you're as a kid, you're just like, I need to minimize the harm that I'm experiencing right now. But yeah, so sorry to get back on point with the identity stuff. Yeah, I realized that like especially with films like Get Out and with Cabin in the Woods and that kind of thing, films that more point at like, hey, the way things have been handled and or just the societal norm is what's the problem, rather than, oh, hey, this person is weird and or evil because of having a physical difference or having a neurodivergence thing or that kind of thing. It's like eluding monstrousness, having that connect to a disability and that kind of thing, rather than societal treatment that led to that point or that kind of thing. Like, when seeing more movies in the horror genre that were of the former kind of, helped me confront a lot of stuff. It's like, oh, it's not that I'm inherently, to quote other people, a freak or like that kind of thing. It's the fact that you think that that's the problem, and that's that kind of thing. And so it kind of, and I think that's also where Carrie comes in. It's like, no, like, I'm not this, like, or like, I guess it could also be seen as embracing that, but it's also like, no, you all are the problem. Like, this is not acceptable. And yeah, so I think that like movies like that honestly helped me form that identity. And I think it's just a byproduct of, stories not being written from the perspectives of not only people with disabilities, but a lot of, marginalized, historically denied people and that kind of thing. It's like, we're not being there. And then like, that's reinforced, like when people see me in Scream still, and that like in real life and like that kind of thing, and how it's like, that's, and seeing those very clear parallels, but as a kid, between how media representation was and how I was directly being treated, in literally being called names from that said media. And yeah, I hope that answered the question. I don't know.
No, absolutely. I mean, and it's interesting, because there are so many parallels, I think, in a lot of our stories in general. But I'm curious to see for you, Nasreen, like how disability representation on screen, whether it was through visible or non-visible discrimination or depiction, how you identified with that or not.
Yeah, I mean, horror as a whole, I think I was attracted to for multiple reasons. One of which, horror just seemed, the genre seemed to be able to take more risks that other film genres weren't taking. And so that that was interesting to me. But this notion that like, someone becomes a monster, whether you're human or not human, because they're different. That always sort of bothered me because, early on, being a kid that was different than most of the other kids in the class, I started to like observe power structures earlier than most of my peers. Um, and so visual difference to me was never scary, I guess, because um, I don't know, maybe I'd been to more places than other people and seen a lot of, I don't know, but someone with a scar or someone with a physical different trait, or someone that covered versus someone that didn't cover, like those things to me weren't scary enough to be monstrous. They weren't scary at all. So I think, I mean, the horror genre, if I'm looking at it as a whole, I think we still have a long ways to go in terms of like, oh, this is a bad person, they have a scar on their face. Like that's always, they always lean into a scar. Are you kidding me? Like that's lots of people have scars on their face, but little kids that see that, or even adults that see that, now have this language associated, whether it's conscious or not, in their brain that scars equal evil. Um, and that's a problem. But it's a problem that I think a lot of filmmakers, thankfully that I've spoken to at least, are starting to address.
It's that whole issue, right? Of, oh, someone has a visible disability or something going on that's physically others them in a movie, and that's then their whole personality. They're not a person, they do not have hobbies or feelings or anything else going on, even outside of genre films. If someone has something physically visible going on, then that's their whole thing. Oh, the person in the wheelchair is just the person in the wheelchair. Where hopefully and thankfully now new generation of filmmakers and TV makers are slowly breaking away from that mold, but it's still a long way to go.
Right. I mean, exactly. Like, when was the last time we saw a character who was a CEO in a wheelchair? But that was never talked about. It was just a description of the character. Um, yeah, I'm
Yeah.
excited for the future.
If I may add to that as well, like even like, someone's gait or how they walk is, seen as, if they're, stumbling or like limping or that kind of thing, then that's, seen as like inherently like off-putting, or you have to like keep an eye on it or that kind of thing. And I remember like literally teaching myself to walk, quote unquote, more normally in a mirror as a kid, so I wouldn't like, because especially with like stuff like Chucky and the Leprechaun, I didn't want to feed into people's idea that I'm to be feared and that kind of thing. And even with like the whole hook hand thing being a thing, and like that, there's parallels with that with people who are like lower arm amputees and like that kind of thing. And it's and these things don't explore, are they evil because of just having a disability, or because of the treatment that they've endured that to get them to that point, or like that kind of thing. And it's just, like Nazreen said, it's just like physical difference evil, or neurodivergence, like in sorry, I'm trying to think of an example. Like I think Hereditary, like there was something with the kid that was doing the vocal tics that was like inherently like this is to be feared and like that kind of thing. It's been a while since I've seen it. I don't fully remember, but yeah. And it's just like, if this is something that we're not used to, then we're not going to examine we're not going to zoom out at all of, figuring out the, ableist lens that, could have fleshed out this character more. We're just going to say 1-to-1 inherently bad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's
Oh,
oh,
sorry,
go
go
ahead,
ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead. Go ahead.
Well, no, but I mean, yeah, it's that idea that you're not really fleshing out your characters. And I think, for me as a creator, like I'm always more interested in kind of what drives characters. And obviously, if your disability is literally the only thing that's not an actual fleshed out character in any way, shape, or form. And so, one of the things that I'm always most interested in is developing characters that interact in very unusual and different kinds of ways. And I think, you know, it's almost like everybody needs to go back to screenwriting 101, and just realize that, it's not enough to have a disability be your thing. It's not enough to have race be your thing. It's not enough for any of those things. Like I look back at films like The Craft, and the fact that race was the thing for, you know, that one character. I can't remember the character's name for the life of me, but it's interesting to me how so many people, when they're writing, tend to use kind of lazy tropes in these specific kinds of ways. But then there are these other films like Malignant. I'm going to take a minute and just mention Malignant because this is a film that I kind of brushed off and was like, yeah, everybody's talking about it, but I don't really need to see it. And then Rabia brought it up to me as an example of non-visible disability, acknowledged for the first time in a very fascinating way. And so we ended up having a whole talk about it, um, for Final Girls Berlin. And it was fascinating to me all of a sudden that, like, a horror movie that seems kind of dopey and strange and silly on the outside could
And
actually
very
have a
camp.
lot to say. Yeah, very camp. Could have a
Very
lot to
camp.
say to the community, whether it meant to or not. And so I wondered if you could maybe talk about that a little bit, Rabia, as to why that spoke to you so much that you recommended it.
Oh wow. Yeah, so Malignant, let's just put that up to the front. I was watching that movie and the whole time going like, "Oh, this is so camp," but I love it. And at the same time, while watching it, I had recently before that seen, and this might be a spoiler for people who haven't seen either, seen Evil Dead Trap, which is a Japanese movie, which has a slightly like similar um villain, let's just say. Only it's more on the eroguru side of things, or pinky guru. So it has like a slightly erotic undertone to the film, whereas Malignant just goes ham. But at the same time, if you take two steps back and watch it from someone who has non-visible disabilities, it's like, oh, but this kind of makes sense. I kind of feel represented, weirdly enough, because I have a lot of stuff going on, and my body kind of feels like that. The spoilers for anyone who hasn't seen Malignant, but that's the only way I can explain it. The main character has a conjoint twin in their brain, attached to their brain, that they've kind of like pushed away in her skull. And he, through an accident that she has, basically reemerges and then starts taking over her body while trapping her mind in herself, and does all kinds of awful stuff. Um but she's been pregnant several times and she's not been able to carry to term, and the whole time this thing in the back of her head that no one was able to see, including herself, was draining the life out of her, making it making trapping her in her body without anyone being able uh to see it, to acknowledge it, to verify it, to but it was happening. So she almost felt gaslit by herself and by her surroundings. And all this time there was a true villain, but it was inside her skull. And weirdly enough for me, that sparked something because I was like, oh, this kind of feels like my medical journey. Like I knew something was wrong and definitely something was happening with me. But all this time, no one was able to see or explain it until it, reared its head either through tests or long, excruciating, uh, you know, uh, um, physical therapies, or like going through blood tests for 8 years and then finally finding out that, oh yeah, we missed this one little factor, and if we had done a scan for this, we would have seen that you've been walking around with this super painful thing in your body this whole freaking time, pardon my French. But yeah, we didn't know, so we were just thinking that you were just all doing this to yourself this whole time. And weirdly enough, I was watching Malignant and I was like, yeah, I feel for her. I have one of those in a weird way in my body as well. Something that's causing something. I don't know how to explain it. It's draining the shit out of me. Um, so yeah, that's why I mentioned that movie when we were doing that conversation back then, because I felt like sometimes, because there's a lot about visual disabilities, of course, and that's in a way, you can see it, so you can quote unquote verify it, so you can acknowledge it. In one way, that's worse because you'll always be visibly confronted with it. But at the same time, for people with non-visible disabilities, I mean, it's a completely different case, because if I'm in a bus and I want to sit down because I literally can't stand anymore, I'm about to collapse, I first have to completely give my medical history to someone who's sitting in the disability seat before I can take that seat, or that they'd stand up for me. I have to verify, almost pick up my doctor's letter and say like, no, really, I'm about to pass out and end up in the hospital if you won't let me sit right now. Please, can I please sit down? I'm not being a lazy person. I just want to survive this bus ride. So yeah, that's I went on
Yeah.
a whole tangent and rant. Sorry, that's my Andy. But yeah, this this
No,
is
but
yeah.
that's completely understandable because, when we talk about non-visible illnesses and disabilities, it's always really fascinating to me that, you have this sort of gatekeeping that happens around the disability identity. And
Yeah.
so this idea of disability identity becomes, almost something that you have to, you know, prove as if you're in a court of law or something. I don't know. Do Nasreen, Colin, do you want to weigh in on this?
Um, I mean, I completely agree. I think having invisible disabilities, you're constantly having to prove what and also teach people what disability is. It's a daily thing. Sometimes it's hourly for me, because if I'm on set or I'm with crew, I'm constantly meeting and working with new people. They're curious why I'm doing things differently than other directors or other cinematographers that they've interacted with. Um, and I have to literally explain. And if I'm feeling nice, I will. But I don't always feel like explaining like why my body is a certain way, or why I'm asking for ingredients. Because if you give me the wrong ingredient, or if I ingest the wrong ingredient, I'm literally out of work for the next 3 days. Um, or if I'm asking if you smoke, because if I inhale that, like I will get a migraine that will last multiple days. I cannot do that, and I shouldn't have to explain that. I think all disabilities. I think we need to take. I don't know how to take away the gatekeeping aspect of it, um, especially with doctors, especially with institutions that say, "Are you in a wheelchair?" I mean, if you even trying to buy a ticket, online, and there being like 4 options for disabilities, and you're like, my disability isn't in there, but I have a need. Like I'm allergic to this thing that you're going to serve to 100 people on this flight. Can I tell you, and that's not a possibility yet either. So we're definitely we're behind. It's time to update a lot of social contracts in terms of like how non-disabled people continually force disabled people to have to explain ourselves and prove ourselves.
Oh yeah, I completely agree with that. It's just it's so painful sometimes. And there in some countries you have these things like badges or like lanyards that you can wear, but I don't yeah, it's like do I always have to like broadcast to the whole fucking world? Like, hey, by the way, I'm kind of dying faster than the rest of you. And I kind of have needs because of that. So, and they hear me saying kind of because I still have myself telling me like, oh, don't make it too big. Like that's like the Indian mom in me, like going like tone it down. But yeah, uh, it's society. We're breaking it down. I have a lot of hope for the next generations. If I look, I have a few kids. They're all Gen Z. If I hear how they talk about identities and acknowledging safe spaces and each other's, visible and non-visible disabilities, there's definitely hope for the future.
I just
Yeah.
wanted to say,
Oh,
oh,
sorry.
sorry, go ahead, Colin.
No, it's just gonna be short. I don't have really much to contribute because I have ADHD and anxiety disorder that the latter of which I'm more able to manage um, than the former. But the um, the way I experience that is through seeing how other people are being told to go through hurdles, whereas people are more likely to ask what I need, or like almost to a degree of coddling sometimes, of being like, are you okay? What do you need? What do you need? Like that kind of thing. If I bring up anything, versus if someone has a non-visible thing, then they'll be asked to present ID. They'll be asked to, like, if I'm on a train, for example, and I got a disabled ticket and it says that on the thing, then they'll be just like, yeah, go ahead. Whereas like I've seen other people, and I'm pretty sure like 99, actually, yeah, I'm 100% sure there's like a white privilege aspect of that as well, because like a lot of the people that have that happen to them aren't white. And it's like, it's, it's shitty. Like, excuse my language again, but like yeah, it's just like, and I just remember thinking whenever that happens, like, why would someone go through the hurdles of making that up? Like, why would, like, like what's the benefit, like, other than like, it's, yeah, we have a long way to go.
It's funny that you mentioned that. Ariel and I, as she mentioned earlier this year, got to speak at South by Southwest. We both had an accessibility A on our badges, and the fact we had the same badge, different names, obviously. Um, that we were speakers, press, and accessibility guests, etc. Not to call out South by Southwest too much, but um, we were by car at a premiere and we had priority access because of our accessibility badges. That means that you can enter the venue 15 minutes, maybe 10 minutes before the whole horde comes in and starts searching for seats. Ariel had dropped me off. She was still parking the car. I have a cane with me and I'm at the door. I'm trying to get into the venue. They tell me no. I showed them my accessibility badge. I'm like, please, guys, I can't walk around the whole building to get to this particular port that you're trying to get me through. Now, I go through 3 supervisors until they finally let me in straight from where I'm standing to the door that I need to be, which I can see. It took so long. Ariel took almost 30 minutes to park and then get through the crowd and come through. She was let in immediately. So by the time that we were able to enter, her and I were entering at the exact same time because, and obviously she showed her accessibility badge, got through the gates immediately. And because it took me 30 minutes to convince 3 supervisors that I was really disabled and was really not able to walk around that whole thing that they wanted me to walk around, we entered at the same time. So I was not able to hold any seats for us or like go in before her and go like, "Hey, we're here." No, we entered at the exact same time because of that. So yeah, that's painfully true.
And interestingly, that was actually, I think, for Everything Everywhere All at Once, the world premiere of that film, which obviously has a lot of notes that, talk about both disability and horror and so forth. And it's interesting because, like, when we talk about, embracing our identities as people who love horror too, because we are talking about both our disability identity and kind of how horror has shaped it in some way. It's interesting when you think about, the gatekeeping that goes on in horror as well. There's so much gatekeeping of what it is to have a disability. There's so much gatekeeping about what it is to love horror. And so it almost becomes like this dual, uh, dual, that's going on kind of all the time. I don't know if gatekeeping is something that you've experienced, Nisreen, in your experience of horror at all?
I mean, yeah. Gatekeeping, I've experienced. I think I experienced gatekeeping. I think gatekeeping can be another word to describe many things, but I experience it every day. Um, I did something interesting. I still have some friends. I've had some friends for like 30 years at this point, and we grew up together, and we had a love for horror, and we used to watch horror together. We would like take VHSs from like Errol's and Blockbusters and sneak to the basement and watch them without my mom's consent. Um, and so I started just making a list of all my favorite films. My top 20 films, and then I started realizing that all of the main characters were white, straight. All of the directors were white and men. Um, and then I was like, oh, this is fucked. How did this? And I'm not going to apologize for my cursing. I think cursing is healthy. So fucking curse away, all of you. um, I was like, wait, if I've been watching white men's films and characters through their POV, um, how did that affect how I see people? Like, how did that affect how I saw um, love interests and people that I respect and look up to? Like, how does that affect me today? So I started then taking notes about like, okay, last favorite 20 films last 20 years or last 10 years, and it's getting better, but it's still predominantly men that are making films, and it's still predominantly white folks that are getting the opportunities to make films. Um, and now I'm paying attention. But when you're a kid, you're just consuming stuff. Steven Spielberg, Ridley Scott, John Carpenter, David Lynch, Joel Schumacher, Joe Dante. These are all straight white men.
It's funny that you're mentioning that specifically. Um, I'm currently working on a panel for something completely different where we're talking about decolonizing your mind when it comes to media, and that is exactly what you're talking about, right? If especially if you live in a Western world, you mostly get exposed to white men's perspectives because the patriarchy here and white societal norms are the quote unquote norm, even for those of us who have no other choice than to just consume it. Um, I was a little bit luckier than you in that sense. I come from a not per se my family, but my network around me because I live in Amsterdam. We have 177 different nationalities in one tiny little city. Like Amsterdam, people think it's like a city. No, it's a village compared to the rest of the world. But we are the most culturally diverse village in the world, factually so. And because of that, I grew up also watching African films, like Arab films, Indonesian films. Obviously, I grew up with a lot of Indian movies growing up. I already mentioned Indonesian, Japanese films. Like the older kids that I would hang with would watch Takashi Miike. So back in high school, I had watched Ichi the Killer. I was into anime, and that kind of shielded me from going full into like colonized media consumption. And but still, even if I would do the same and look to a top 20 list, it would still be too white for for my taste, too non-disabled, white heteronormative for someone who is, POC queer and disabled herself. So yeah, there's definitely, I mean, we're making small steps with having, Lee Jung Jae from Squid Game now win the Emmys, and um, Parasite win the Oscars. But then again, South Korea is a very strong soft power, and they've been building to this status for the past 30 years. It's one of the things that I worked for and studied. Um, and it should be across the board. I'm missing too many African voices. There are so many countries in Africa that have amazing stories to tell, have amazing myths and lore, and they're just not getting the funding because the people with the money and the power have deemed them like, oh, it's Africa, I'm not going to give money. So they are making with their own resources, like iPhone shot little things and hoping to grow and get discovered. But I think there's so many voices in South America, in Asia, in Africa, in those continents that we're missing out on because the dominant voice is indeed a ableist, white, heteronormative male. So
And it's so true, and I can attest to this as a white person having seen, obviously right side by side with Rabia, a lot of these very particular kinds of ways in which intersectionality is playing out in our lives. One thing that, really heartens me though is knowing that there are so many creators like us out there right now doing this work and trying to work with intentionality. And I wondered if maybe Colin and Nasreen, maybe if I could ask you first, Colin, to kind of comment on like what do you hope to accomplish in your work going forward as a disabled horror creator?
Sure. So, I actually was turned on to the film Freaks, like the 1932 film. I hadn't heard of it, hadn't like watched any of it until very recently, and it was, granted, made in 32, so a lot of stuff doesn't hold up to today's like stuff, but like still the story itself of like this revenge film and showing people with disabilities outside of circus life and like that kind of thing, there's things in it that are like revolutionary for that time, let alone now. And it's like, so that's kind of the stuff that I want to make. And like it's interesting that you mentioned Parasite, because we see a full lens of, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Parasite, uh which, why haven't you seen Parasite? But like uh we see why the family does what they do in that film. We see like the dad's like all these things that affect his psyche to the point of him, quote unquote, snapping and stabbing the person. And like and if that was just done with disability, if we like saw like the psychological things that people go through and like the development of that, and like that's the stuff I want to do. I want to make films that like, if I'm making someone with a disability be like, I'm not saying that like someone with a disability can't be the bad person, like that kind of thing. I just want there to be justification and there to be the actual reason, other than left to the audience to assume that it's because of the disability that they're evil. And because that's going to be the assumption, because that's what it has been for years. And so I want to make things that just, again, low bar, but like, just humanize and like develop people into actual humans, and we see why, and we see like the, I really love the thing of like, oh, these people that you assume that you might be like that you might be a part of, that you might participate in, whether it's like classism or disability or racism or that kind of thing, that you might passively partake in, or like need to, that you reap the benefits of passively, is the problem. And you are part of that, even if you're just a bystander who does nothing and you consider yourself a good person because you're not actively being bad. You're still, and that's what I want to explore, because I feel like that's a very rich thing that hasn't been fully, like, obviously there's stuff like Get Out, like Parasite, like all these like amazing films that have explored that, but it's still a well that's vastly untapped in comparison to the, and like that's kind of also my response to people being like, oh, you want to be so woke, or and I was like, no, I just want to tell interesting stories, like, and if that goes hand in hand with being progressive and being that kind of thing, then that's like great. And if that makes you mad, then honestly good. Like,
And complicity is so complex as a concept to really untangle in a certain kind of way. And I completely agree with you that those are such meaningful and important stories that, I can't wait to see what you have coming out along those lines. It, it's such an exciting kind of way to look at the world in a different way. What about for you, Nisreen?
I have a very limited number of years on Earth, and I want to make films and find collaborators who are interested in telling authentic stories. And because I only have a limited number of stories that I can tell in one lifetime, I want to make stories that have lead characters that we haven't seen before, that we haven't seen enough of. I think the medium of film and television is so incredibly powerful. I think if you have the privilege of helping to tell a story, then you have a responsibility to shift our culture to something that's a little bit more equal, because we're not equal. Disabled people are not equal. People with heavily melanated skin are not equal. People who are LGBTQ are not equal. We have still so much work to do. So getting to collaborate with filmmakers to make films like Night Waking, it's a lesbian couple that have 2 children. Like, how often do we get to see that on screen? Not often enough. And just making those connections for me is so important. My dad, comes from an Iraqi family. We were stuck there in the Gulf War. I witnessed that, and now as an adult, I look back at that situation, and I look at Dune, one of my favorite films of all time. And there are so many reference points to, like, there's also disability in that film too. We could totally unpack that. I don't know if we have time, but if Dune actually had Middle Eastern characters in it, would we have entered Iraq as a country? Would we have been okay with that? So if you start to draw those lines and make those connections to realize how important film and television are, how we could be predicting the future and stopping such horrible things from happening if we just own that responsibility.
That's such a powerful point. And, and Dune is one of those works that I think is seminal for a lot of us who are interested in genre in any way, shape, or form. And, for me, like, as a white person watching it, like, I actually, because when I was young, a lot of my closest friend when I was young was actually Iraqi as well. And so I didn't understand why there weren't brown people there. It didn't make sense to me. Because that was, why are these white people in the middle of this story? But representation is so incredibly important, and it's such a big part of what we are all doing to kind of change the industry. And I am so proud of this panel specifically, of people who are doing things to kind of change the way that representation is shifting in Hollywood and beyond. And I would love for each of us to kind of go around and talk a little bit about where you can see your work, and if there is a place where people can reach you on socials. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up this conversation, which has been so wonderful. And I want to thank you all so much for everything you've contributed. But I do want to make sure that our audience knows exactly how to connect with you and your work going forward, because I'm so excited to see what you bring to the stage. Colin, would you like to start? Uh-oh, it looks like Colin is frozen at the moment. Nisreen, would you like to start?
Oh, sure, yeah. You can find me on Instagram at content director, and you can see some of the work that I've done on allmediastorytelling.com. But a lot of the films that I work on go into film festivals and sort of have a festival circuit. And so there are 3 films I'm working on right now that are disability based and related, that will come through soon. And I'll be sure to share those on my social.
Awesome. And Rabia, would you like to share?
Well, they'll be seeing you and me for the rest of the day. But in case you're not tuning in later today, I am on all social media as RPISH, pronounced Arpish. I do a lot of different stuff. And I work with a lot of different awesome people. If you want to see me talk about pop culture, about activism, about intersectional identities, just keep an eye on my Twitter. That's where I mostly announce the stuff. That's the most recent. I do have an Instagram. I'm not as active on there. I even have a TikTok. I'm not as active on there either. I kind of have dysmorphia, body dysmorphia. So I don't like looking at myself, hence not filming or taking pictures of myself. But I'm trying to slowly overcome this bit by bit. But yeah, on my socials, you can definitely find me at RPISH. And obviously, the podcast that I do together with Ariel, which is Ride the Omnibus, but on socials, it's Omnibus Ride.
Great.
Oh, and Colin's back.
And Colin is back. So Colin, would you please share info about what your work is and how people can access what you do and who you are?
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet decided to crap out and then had to reboot. So my socials are at Coco Bucks, COCOBUCKS, and at Chromatic Lens Films on Instagram. And yeah, so my website is colin-buckingham.com. And so soon I will probably just be releasing, like open to the public, a short that I wrote and produced and did the stunts coordination and stuff for a couple years ago. And then pandemic happened and that kind of threw everything. But so that'll be coming out soon. And then yeah, that's about all I got for now. And yeah, that's about it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Colin. And just to let you know, my work, Ariel Basca, you can find out more about me and what I do at arielbasca.com. You can find out more about what Rabia and I do at omnibusride.com. But this has been a lovely panel. Thank you so much, Colin and Nisreen, for joining us. This has been a delight. Thank you so much to our watchers from all over the world, both in the live stream and recording later. Thank you so much for joining us, and please come back when at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time, we'll be talking about mental health and horror, the mind
Yes.
and body connection.
Definitely. And also keep an eye out on the Ghouls Twitter account. I think it might be handy that we repost all the Twitter info and mentions and Instagram handles that were just mentioned. I saw someone asking it in the comments just now, so that if people want to go back and look up Nasreen and Colin, they will be able to look that up in the feed of Ghouls.
Thanks so
Awesome.
much for having me. It was great to talk to you.
Thank you
Yeah,
for coming.
thanks so much.
Thank you
Yes.
so much.
And for those tuning in later, see you all in a bit. It is time for me to take a little mental break. How about you, Ariel?
Yep, same. All right. Over and out.